What if I told you that Britain, Earth's most tragic monarch, wasn't just mad? He was conducting experiments on his own blood. Behind the velvet curtains of Kew Palace, King George III built a private world no one dared question. A world of locked doors, trembling servants, and royal children treated more like subjects in a laboratory than heirs to a throne. Historians called it illness. Physicians called it divine punishment. But the truth was far darker. An obsession with purity, discipline, and the human mind that spiraled into cruelty disguised as love. For centuries, this story was buried under royal secrecy. But newly uncovered records and letters reveal what really happened inside those silent rooms. The twisted routines, the broken minds, and the king who tried to cure his own madness through the suffering of his children. This is the story they never wanted you to know. Night at Kew Palace never truly slept. The air hung thick with oil smoke and silence, a silence that trembled like breath held too long. Along the narrow corridors, servants moved like phantoms, their footsteps swallowed by carpets faded from decades of secrets. Somewhere deeper in the palace, a door slammed. Not loud, but sharp enough to make every candle quiver. The king was awake again. Those who worked closest to him spoke in murmurs they never finished. They said his voice had changed. Sometimes he shouted at shadows. Sometimes he whispered to someone who wasn't there. The walls, they said, carried his conversations long after dawn, as if the plaster itself remembered what no one dared repeat. The Queen had stopped asking questions. The children had stopped speaking after supper. It was safer that way. In the courtyard below, frost crawled up the windows like pale veins. Every night, the king's lantern flickered through the upper windows, pacing light, restless and uneven. Servants learned to read its rhythm like a warning. When the glow moved quickly, no one slept. They knew what it meant. Another episode, another long night of commands that made no sense. Curtains had to be drawn, books rearranged, even the clocks were wound to his strange new pattern of time. The palace itself seemed to breathe with him. Pipes rattled, doors shuddered. Once, a maid swore she saw ink dripping from the walls of his study, forming words before drying into nothing. No one believed her, but no one doubted the place was changing. The old warmth of royal life, laughter, music, perfume, had curdled into something colder. Kew had become a vessel for his unraveling mind. Behind locked doors, the children listened. They were told their father was ill, that his outbursts were storms to be waited out. But even storms have rhythm. His did not. One moment, he would call for prayer. The next, he would order every mirror covered as if frightened by his own reflection. He forbade certain colors. He refused certain foods. He insisted that his mind was too alive, that others simply could not keep up with him. The doctors nodded, the servants obeyed, and the walls continued to listen. By midnight, the halls carried the echo of a tune, a broken hum, rising and falling in the dark. It was the king, alone in his chamber, speaking to the night in fragments. "Balance," he whispered. "Purity. Order." Then laughter, thin and uneven, as if spoken by two voices at once. Downstairs, a child pressed her ear to the floorboards and began to cry without knowing why. Something had begun at Kew Palace. Something that would not end with madness, but with method. Morning arrived at Kew like a hesitant guest. Pale light slipped through the shutters, but it could not soften what the night had left behind. The king had not slept. His footsteps had never ceased. By dawn, he appeared in the corridor, still wearing his nightrobe, its hem stained with spilled ink and something darker. His eyes darted, following thoughts that no one else could see. He demanded that every clock in the palace be checked, then shouted when two ticked out of rhythm. He claimed their discord was poisoning the air, distorting time itself. Servants scrambled to fix the mechanisms, while he muttered about invisible vibrations, tiny errors that, he said, could destroy the order of the world. No one argued. They had learned that contradiction could summon his rage faster than thunder. Breakfast was a theater of unease. The royal children sat in silence while their father spoke to no one at all. He smiled into the empty chair beside him, poured tea for it, and asked if they had slept well. When his eldest son dared to answer, the king slammed his hand on the table, silverware leaping, voice cracking through the hall like a whip. "Not you," he hissed. "You wouldn't understand." Then, just as quickly, the calm returned. Smile, politeness, apology. An actor switching masks too fast to follow. Physicians came and went, whispering theories of the humors and the mind. They suggested leeches, mercury tonics, and long walks in the gardens. George obeyed only when it pleased him. On bad days, he insisted the earth itself tilted beneath his feet, that Q was slipping into the sea. He would stand by the windows, motionless for hours, watching nothing, muttering that he could hear the palace breathing. Soon, the servants began keeping count. Days since the last outburst. Nights without sleep. Hours between laughter and rage. They wrote the numbers on scraps hidden behind portraits. Quiet acts of survival. Each tally marked another descent. The queen moved like a ghost herself, avoiding her husband's gaze, her hands trembling when she reached for her children. One evening, a scream echoed from the library. When they arrived, they found the king surrounded by torn pages, volumes ripped open, their ink smeared across the floor like spilled blood. He said he'd found something in the text, a pattern that wasn't meant to be read. "They hide it in words," he whispered, "the way they hide truth in children." No one dared ask what he meant. By the time night fell again, the palace had taken on a new rhythm, measured by fear instead of clocks. Servants began locking their doors. The children whispered prayers to a silent God. And above them all, the king continued pacing, each footstep like a question with no answer. The nursery windows were always shuttered now. Sunlight, their tutor said, disturbed the king's temper, so the children learned to live in dimness. Soft candlelight, muffled voices, lessons spoken as if in a church. The air carried the faint smell of lavender and iron, a mixture that clung to their clothes long after they left the room. Every hour was a rehearsal in silence. They moved through their days with precision, walking when bells rang, sitting when footsteps approached, smiling when the door opened. Their mother's eyes lingered too long on each of them, as if counting their breaths. None of them dared to ask why. They already knew that questions fed the darkness. At night, they heard their fathers pacing above, the uneven rhythm of boots on wooden floors. Sometimes he spoke their names aloud, not as a father calling his children, but like a priest reciting from memory. His voice carried through the vents, heavy with command, stripped of warmth. When it stopped, they lay awake, afraid of what the silence might mean. One evening, their governess found them arranging pebbles on the carpet, small patterns that looked like constellations. The youngest whispered that it kept him calm, though she could not say who she meant. The stones remained there for days, untouched, as if the room itself understood the ritual. Meals were served without conversation, each plate identical, each bite measured. The king had ordered that food be weighed before and after consumption. "Discipline strengthens the spirit," he said through the closed door. Servants followed his command with trembling hands, their eyes never meeting the children's. The sound of scales clicking became the house's new heartbeat. Outside, the gardens grew wild. Roses strangled their own stems, ivy crawled over marble statues. The children were forbidden to step beyond the hedges, told that the air carried sickness. Still, they watched the overgrown paths from their windows, wondering if freedom had a scent. Sometimes, at dusk, a low hum drifted through the corridors, a melody with no words. It wasn't the king's voice this time. It came from the walls, the pipes, the bones of the building. The eldest swore it was the house singing. The others believed it was the sound of prayers gone unanswered. When storms rolled in, thunder blurred with the king's shouting, both tearing through the night in jagged bursts. The youngest covered her ears, whispering her alphabet backwards to keep her mind still. In the morning, their room smelled faintly of burnt oil and candle wax, though no flame had been lit. Obedience became their shield. Stillness became survival. The children no longer spoke of escape, only endurance. And as the palace exhaled its endless sighs, they began to understand. Their father's madness was not a passing storm. It was the new weather of their lives. They said the nursery lights never went out after midnight. The air smelled of chalk and laudanum, a sterile sweetness that clung to the lace curtains. In the center of the room stood a narrow bed, smaller than a coffin, lined with pale silk. The king entered alone, holding a trembling glass vial in his gloved hand, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floorboards. The child, no older than 7, stirred awake under the dim glow of candlelight. "Father!" he whispered, but the voice that answered him did not sound like a father's at all. George's eyes glistened with a feverish gleam, not of anger, but of revelation. He believed the body could be purified through terror. That pain itself could expel the demons gnawing at the royal mind. The experiment began with silence. Not a scream, not a command. Only the steady drip of the vial's contents onto pale skin. The liquid hissed like metal meeting flame. The boy's pulse thrashed beneath the surface, a faint flutter beneath translucent veins. George watched as if he were observing an eclipse, something forbidden yet divine. He recorded every moment in a black notebook bound with crimson thread. The ink blotched from his shaking hand. Temperature, elevated. Pupils, dilated. Response, divine agitation. His handwriting fragmented, the words twisting into illegible spirals halfway down the page. He whispered prayers between observations. Fragments of psalms he could no longer recall correctly. Cleanse, the weakness. Burn the shadow. Outside, servants pretended not to hear. The palace had grown used to strange noises, thuds, muffled cries, doors that opened without cause. But this sound was different. It carried a rhythm, like ritual. Hours later, when the candles guttered out, George sat motionless beside the bed. The boy breathed shallowly, eyes glassy but alive. The king smiled faintly, as though satisfied that the darkness within him had been transferred, even if only for a moment. The next morning, the court physician found him asleep in the chair, his hand resting on the child's wrist, as though guarding a fragile experiment. No one dared to ask what had happened. The notebook had vanished, and the king's first words upon waking were a whisper. "Bring me the others. The cure is not yet complete." The palace did not feel alive anymore. It watched. Every polished surface reflected something that was quite real, a shimmer at the corner of sight, a distortion of faces passing in the candlelight. Even the servants had begun to move differently. They whispered in hallways that once rang with music, stepping carefully, as if the marble itself might listen. King George's chambers had grown darker, their heavy drapes drawn at all hours. The mirrors were covered, yet somehow he still felt observed. At first, he claimed it was the lingering judgment of courtiers, who no longer dared to approach. But soon, it became something else. A pressure, an intelligence, in the air itself. He said the palace walls had learned to remember. Visitors spoke of strange echoes, laughter where no one stood, footsteps that stopped when one turned around. Some said the chandeliers swayed on windless nights, their crystals shivering as if something brushed past them. The guards began refusing their midnight shifts, and when dawn came, they were pale, shaking, unable to describe what they'd seen. Only that the silence had moved. A court physician noted the king's handwriting had changed. His letters bent upward, frantic and uneven. One message to Parliament was nothing but a series of spirals. Another contained only 2 words, repeated again and again. "She's listening." But no one knew who she was. When the Queen's apartments were sealed without notice, the staff began to vanish, one by one. Officially, they were dismissed. Unofficially, no one saw them leave. Their rooms remained untouched, the air faintly perfumed, as though they had simply dissolved into the curtains. At dusk, the great clock in the East Hall started ticking backward. It lasted only a few seconds before the mechanism shattered, scattering brass teeth and springs across the floor. From then on, the king forbade anyone from speaking of time inside the palace. He claimed it had become infected. In the rare moments he appeared in public, George's eyes seemed fixed on something just behind whoever spoke to him. His smile lingered too long, Courtiers whispered that he conversed with invisible companions, that he bowed to the corners of the room, murmuring replies to unheard voices. And yet no one dared call him mad. The throne room remained immaculate. The gold still gleamed. To the world, Britain was steady. But inside Windsor, reality had started to rot quietly, and the rot wore silk gloves. The western wing had always been silent, even in the days of celebration. It was the oldest part of the palace, its corridors too narrow, its ceilings too low, its air too still. Few entered now. The guards stationed there spoke little, and those who did were transferred within weeks, their reports filled with strange phrasing, sentences that began clearly and ended in trembling lines, as if their hands had forgotten how to finish a thought. At the entrance stood a single door, bolted from the outside, painted the color of dried blood. On its surface, someone had etched a pattern of concentric circles, thin and uneven, as though scratched by a dull blade. No servant claimed to have done it. No one dared to clean it off. The king called it his hall of mirrors, though no reflection remained within. The glass panes inside that part of the palace had been removed, smashed or hidden, no one knew. Still, those who passed by swore they saw movement inside. A flicker, a figure, sometimes several. One maid described it as a room that doesn't want to be looked at. After that, she left without collecting her wages. At night, the wing seemed to pulse faintly, as if the structure itself breathed. Shadow spilled out under the door, though no candles burned beyond it. The smell was metallic, not of rot, but of something sharp, chemical, and ancient. When questioned, the king dismissed it. "You're smelling memory," he said. "This place is remembering what I asked it to." There were rumors that he spent whole nights inside, barefoot, tracing invisible diagrams across the floor. The guards would hear faint murmuring, rhythmic, almost liturgical. Once, someone heard a child's voice answer him. By morning, the king would emerge with soot on his hands and ink across his sleeves, muttering about replication and correction. The next day, his handwriting would change again. The queen's rooms, sealed by royal order, were connected by a hidden passage to this forbidden wing. A few dared to suggest reopening it, but the king's fury silenced them. He claimed the West Wing contained unfinished music, and that if anyone interrupted, it would start again, louder. Sometimes, during official visits, the king would pause mid-sentence, turn toward the western wall, and smile. "They're awake," he would say softly. "Can't you hear them breathing?" None answered. But more than one visitor later confessed that, for a single second, they had heard it too. Not breathing exactly, but something close enough to make their skin crawl. The palace, it seemed, had become a living thing, one that understood loneliness and chose to imitate it. The study was no longer a room. It had become a theater of order and paranoia. Shelves sagged under the weight of journals, each page filled with angular writing, diagrams, and sketches that seemed to crawl across the paper. Quills scratched feverishly, dipping into ink as black as spilled night, leaving patterns that resembled constellations more than sentences. George moved among them with the precision of a conductor, arranging, rearranging, annotating, until the lines themselves appeared alive, pulsing with intent. He collected instruments like trophies of the mind, brass compasses, glass cylinders, pendulums that swung endlessly without pause. Thermometers and scales lined the walls, calibrated with obsessive exactitude. Each device measured subtle movements in the children's behavior. Every breath and blink recorded as a note in a symphony only the king could hear. He claimed these tools would reveal hidden truths, the architecture of obedience, the pathways of the soul. Yet each day the truth became more distorted, bending under the weight of his mania. Patterns emerged in his work, but not the ones he sought. Spirals of ink, crossing lines, and annotations in trembling script betrayed a mind teetering at the edge of comprehension. Still, he persevered, convinced that chaos could be measured, controlled, and finally perfected. He worked late into the night, candle flames dancing on the walls, shadows twisting into forms that seemed to move independently. Sometimes he laughed quietly, as if he had discovered a secret no one else could fathom. The children were silent observers of this ritual. They were summoned to the study not as family, but as subjects. Their hands hovered over charts, their eyes followed pendulums, their hearts beat in sync with the rhythm of his obsession. Every movement was scrutinized, every hesitation logged. A slight tilt of the head, a finger tapping the table, all became proof of resistance or compliance. The king recorded it meticulously, never pausing, never forgiving the smallest imperfection. Servants whispered about the sounds from the study, the constant scratching of quills, the muttered calculations, the sudden exclamations that rang through the corridors. Occasionally, a page would flutter to the floor, revealing cryptic notes. Threshold of fear reached, cognition altered, or pattern complete, yet unstable. No one could read the full context, and none dared to ask. Even the walls seemed to participate. Faded tapestries vibrated as if alive. Carpets shifted slightly under invisible weight, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, the scent of ink, wax, and obsession. The palace itself had become a recording instrument, amplifying each note of George's descent. Every corner, every shadow, every object was incorporated into a design only he could comprehend. By the hours just before dawn, he would sit back, eyes glassy, hands trembling, notebooks brimming with data that made sense to no one but him. The children left quietly, the instruments untouched, and the servants whispered that even the moon seemed hesitant to peek through the drapes. In that silence, the palace waited, ready for the next stage of its master's experiments, darker, stranger, more relentless than before. It began with a tremor in the smallest gestures. One child, the eldest, hesitated when instructed, a subtle pause that George noticed immediately. The king's gaze fell like ice upon the boy, sharp enough to draw blood from the air. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to echo in unison with the child's misstep. Silence became thicker, heavier, suffocating. For the first time, one of the children faltered, and the palace itself seemed to respond. George's reaction was not sudden. It was deliberate, ritualized. He led the child to the study, where charts and instruments stood like silent sentinels, each one marking prior deviations. The king's hand hovered over the pendulum, letting it swing slowly, measuring hesitation. He whispered about imbalances, fractures in the soul, and the necessity of correction. Then he began, a regimen that was neither corporal nor spoken, but a trial of shadows and perception. Candles were extinguished and relit in irregular intervals. A clock's hands spun backward and forward, counting time that no one could track. The child was made to move through corridors lined with mirrors, forced to watch reflections shift and distort, observing them as if they were alive. Each mirror displayed a version of the child's actions, delayed, exaggerated, almost grotesque. George marked reactions meticulously, noting fear, confusion, and any hint of defiance. Servants, who dared not intervene, whispered in hushed tones about the change in atmosphere. The air became taut, charged with anticipation and dread. Shadows in the corners grew denser, coalescing into forms that seemed to follow every step. Even the walls pulsed faintly, the old plaster contracting as if the building itself acknowledged the rebellion. Every object, every sound, every candle flicker was now part of the experiment. Hours passed like eternity. The child's eyes, wide with comprehension of the power arrayed against him, mirrored a strange resilience. A single misstep would have brought an immediate response, but the king paused, studying, analyzing, letting the suspense sink in deeper than any punishment could. It was a new cruelty, not in pain, but in the orchestration of fear, the ritualization of control. By the end, the child had complied outwardly, but George's obsession had intensified. Notes were scribbled feverishly, diagrams of behavior, the sequence of reactions, predictions of failure and success. The king's mind now revolved entirely around this experiment, and the palace became a living archive of terror. Each corridor, room, and shadow was catalogued. Each sigh, glance, and heartbeat was a record of obedience or resistance. That night, as the candles guttered and the wind howled against the palace walls, the other children watched quietly from their rooms. The breaking point had arrived, and they understood without words that their world had transformed. Obedience was no longer choice. Rebellion had become a map of shadows and consequence, and George's experiments had claimed a new dimension, one where fear itself was instrument, audience, and teacher. The sunlight that filtered through the nursery windows never reached Amelia. Curtains of heavy damask dulled the day to a muted glow, and the air smelled faintly of wax and herbs, camphor, lavender, and something bitter that no one dared name. She lay in a bed narrower than the room itself, her body pale, almost translucent, as if the walls had begun to draw the color from her. Her breathing was shallow, measured, each inhale a deliberate act against the unseen weight pressing upon her chest. Servants tiptoed past, their whispers cautious, eyes downcast, as if the mere acknowledgement of her presence might disturb the fragile rhythm of her fragile body. Even the children avoided her room unless summoned. It was understood instinctively that she was the epicenter of the king's obsession. George visited often, his footsteps echoing in the hall like a distant drum. Sometimes he would sit silently beside her bed, not speaking, only watching. Other times he would lean close, murmuring fragments of encouragement or admonishment, the lines between care and command dissolving. Amelia's tiny hands rested in the king's palm, yet the touch brought no warmth. She had learned to still her movements, to regulate her breathing, to anticipate the cadence of his moods as carefully as a musician listens for a conductor. hand. Her illness was never named aloud, but everyone in the palace knew it was more than frailty. It was as if the very life within her had become another subject of study, a pattern to be observed, tested, and catalogued. She was given elixirs, tinctures, and mixtures of obscure origin, none of which were explained, all of which were administered under George's direct instruction. He called them measures of balance, but to those who witnessed them, they seemed like whispered prayers to a force no one else could see. At night, when the candles guttered and the palace exhaled its creaking sighs, Amelia's eyes reflected shadows moving across the walls. Sometimes she whispered to herself, small fragments of songs her siblings had taught her, soft rhythms meant to anchor her mind against the currents of fear that flowed constantly through the palace. The king's presence was never far, even if he did not enter. A footstep, a faint shuffle of silk. She knew he was watching. The other children observed her silently, learning the codes of her weakness and strength. They moved like phantoms through the corridors, avoiding disruption, cataloguing their own actions alongside hers. Amelia's illness, so fragile and exacting, became the lens through which the children understood the palace's new laws. Obedience was survival, presence was a trial, and the king's gaze could turn a heartbeat into an eternity. Even when she slept, the faintest rise and fall of her chest carried meaning. Every breath, every sigh, every flutter of eyelids was recorded mentally by George, who considered her body both a mirror and a canvas. And within the quiet, dim room, a single truth hung suspended. Amelia was the axis around which the palace had begun to revolve, and the shadow of her suffering would stretch far beyond the walls. George's presence was a pendulum swinging between warmth and terror. Some moments he would brush Amelia's hair with a gentle hand, murmuring praise for the smallest gestures, a slight tilt of her head, a carefully measured sigh. The air would soften around her. Her pulse slowed, as if the room itself responded to his benign attention. Yet the relief was always temporary. The king's tenderness was merely a prelude, a test of compliance, a subtle mechanism to heighten the contrast with what would inevitably follow. One day, he instructed her to draw lines across a blank page, each one a fraction of an inch apart, perfectly parallel. Amelia worked with painstaking care, every stroke measured, her small fingers trembling. When George leaned over her shoulder, the praise was sweet but sharp. A single misalignment elicited a cold stare that froze the marrow of her spine. His approval was a fragile thing, fragile enough that a momentary lapse could transform warmth into silence so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. He spoke often in riddles, weaving affection and admonishment into sentences that twisted back on themselves. "The mind," he whispered one afternoon, "can only expand if it is contained. The heart must bend before it can bloom." Amelia nodded, learning to pass his words for danger as much as meaning. She understood that every caress, every whispered commendation carried a hidden weight. His attention was both blessing and cage, the two indistinguishable until it was too late. Evenings were the most disorienting. The king would sit at the foot of her bed, tracing invisible patterns in the air with a fingertip, humming quietly as though orchestrating an unseen mechanism. Sometimes he would ask her to repeat phrases, sing lines of poetry, or recount memories from the day, each repetition scrutinized for hesitation or error. Compliance was rewarded with the faintest smile, a warmth that vanished if she faltered. Over time, the rhythm became addictive. Perform, please, survive. And the cycle began again. The servants, who once tried to intervene with gentle remedies or comforting words, quickly realized that nothing could temper George's method. Even a whispered reassurance risked bringing his wrath. They moved like shadows themselves, aware that any misstep, however minor, could ripple across the fragile balance between tenderness and torment. The palace itself seemed to echo the oscillation. The candles flickered differently depending on the king's mood. The tapestries appeared to shiver in anticipation, and the floorboards creaked under invisible weight. Amelia, fragile and keenly aware, began to anticipate every mood swing, every subtle cue, the slight tightening of his jaw, the softening of his gaze, the almost imperceptible shuffle of his slipper across the floor. Her life became an intricate dance of observation and reaction, a silent dialogue with a man whose love was a labyrinth and whose torment was precise. Within these carefully measured hours, the child learned a truth that no one dared speak aloud. In the king's world, affection and cruelty were indistinguishable, and survival depended on the mastery of both. The children had learned to speak in shadows. Words were dangerous. Even a whisper could carry the weight of punishment. Yet necessity forged ingenuity. Amelia's siblings developed signals. A tilt of the head, the faintest tap of a finger, a quiet sigh. Small gestures that carried volumes. They were invisible messages, a secret language woven through the palace's endless corridors and shuttered windows. By candlelight, the children would huddle in corners where George's shadow never reached, tracing patterns on the floor with their toes or tapping messages against the walls. Every rhythm, every repeated motion was a declaration of life, a silent rebellion against the king's pervasive control. Even the servants began to understand, exchanging glances and subtle nods, their compliance masking complicity. Within the palace, secrecy became both weapon and shield. Letters were another form of defiance. Tiny scraps of paper hidden beneath floorboards, between the spines of books, or sewn into the hems of garments. They contained fragments of song, coded descriptions of observations, or simple reminders that the siblings were not alone. Each note carried hope, a tether to reality that the king's experiments sought to sever. The writing was miniature and meticulous, each stroke deliberate, a protective ritual as much as a message. But the king's obsession extended beyond observation. He began to monitor patterns in movement, sound, and even breath. The children adapted, learning to synchronize their signals with the ebb and flow of his attention. One child would delay a gesture until the pendulum swung out of line. Another would wait until the faintest echo in the hall masked a whisper. Every secret exchange was a performance. The risk of discovery hung over them like storm clouds. In these clandestine moments, laughter became forbidden, replaced by shared glances and subtle smiles. Their eyes carried what mouths could not speak. They learned patience, timing, and the quiet artistry of evasion. The palace, with its shifting shadows and corridors that seemed to twist, became their ally in concealment. Every crack in the walls, every flutter of curtain, every draft of air was used to transmit meaning across impossible distances. Even Amelia, weakened by illness and constant scrutiny, participated. She became the nucleus of their coded system, a living anchor, whose fragile presence gave significance to every hidden gesture. The children's survival depended on maintaining cohesion, a network of subtle rebellion against a father whose intellect had become a labyrinth of fear. Each signal preserved a fraction of freedom, a flicker of autonomy that George could not yet extinguish. But tension grew, like a taut string ready to snap. Every successful communication carried the seed of exposure. George's experiments had sharpened his senses. He noticed anomalies, pauses, inconsistencies. The smallest hesitation in a step, the briefest glance toward a shadow, could betray a secret. And with each passing day, the children realized that their rebellion, however delicate, was walking a knife's edge. One misstep could shatter their fragile sanctuary, and the consequences would be immediate and merciless. The room was unnervingly still, as if the palace itself had been holding its breath. Amelia lay in her narrow bed, pale against the dim glow of a single flickering candle. The hours had stretched endlessly, filled with rigid routines, coded signals, and the constant pressure of her father's watchful gaze. Even shadows seemed to lean closer, pressing in from the corners of the chamber. Her strength, once subtle but persistent, was eroding under the weight of expectation and terror. George entered without sound, his footsteps precise, measured, like a metronome counting down to an unseen climax. He observed her, as he always did, noting the faint tremor in her fingers, the almost imperceptible hesitation in her breathing. A smile touched his lips, tender yet cold, because to him this was not suffering. It was revelation. The collapse of Amelia's composure, her very essence bending under his scrutiny, was a confirmation of his own intricate designs. For hours he hovered, alternating between whispered praise and taut admonishment. A small misalignment in her posture, a slow blink, or a paused exhalation would draw a reaction. A delicate tilt of the head, a hand raised in silent insistence, a quill poised mid-air. Every motion was scrutinized, catalogued, and mentally charted. The child's exhaustion became his instrument. Her faint, ragged sighs were the notes he conducted. It was as though the very air inside the chamber had transformed into a substance of control, dense and suffocating, forcing compliance through invisible pressure. At one point, Amelia tried to speak, to whisper a protest, a question, or even a plea, but her voice faltered under the weight of expectation. Her eyes widened, meeting her father's gaze, and in that instant, a flicker of recognition passed between them. A shared awareness that the line between care and cruelty had long been erased. The king nodded, as if approving some secret performance, unaware that he had pushed her too far. The room's atmosphere shifted. Tension became tangible, oppressive, and nearly electric. Then, without warning, Amelia's body gave way. A small convulsion of exhaustion rippled through her limbs, and she slumped, fragile and unsteady, into the sheets. George's expression remained calm, but the corners of his mind recoiled. The precise machinery of control had failed to anticipate this, an anomaly outside his calculations. In that fragile collapse, the delicate balance between the children's compliance and the king's obsession had fractured. The child, once the anchor of order, had become a mirror, reflecting the extremity of his mania. The palace itself seemed to respond. Shadows deepened, the walls groaned with latent energy, and distant corridors carried sounds that were half whisper, half cry. The other children watched silently, hearts pounding, realizing the full weight of George's obsession. His mental unraveling, subtle and creeping until now, had become unavoidable. Amelia's collapse marked a pivot. The experiments had ceased to be controlled trials. They had become the expression of a mind teetering into unrestrained fixation. And in the faint, flickering candlelight, one truth was undeniable. The king's pursuit of perfect obedience, precision, and understanding had reached a point from which there was no return. The palace had transformed into a theater of obsession, and Amelia, fragile and broken, was the signal that the boundaries of power, love, and cruelty had dissolved entirely. By the time the corridors of Kew Palace fell silent, George himself had become a prisoner of his obsessions. The grand halls, once alive with measured steps and whispered commands, were now empty, save for the faint echoes of a man conversing with shadows. Servants spoke of doors bolted from within, of windows shuttered so tightly that daylight struggled to penetrate, and of the faint murmur of voices that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. He had retreated into a single suite, known among the palace staff only as the Blue Room. named for its walls draped in deep, fading azure. Here, time lost meaning. Hours blended with days, nights with endless candlelight. The king wandered among his journals, instruments, and charts, but increasingly, they spoke to him less than the whispers that crept through the room. Voices, faint and insistent, murmured secrets and accusations, replaying events long past with cruel insistence. Sometimes they repeated his own words, mocking, twisting, turning them into riddles he could not solve. The staff avoided the blue room entirely, leaving meals and medicines at the door, hesitant to observe the man who now seemed half alive, half conjured by the very obsessions that had consumed him. They whispered of him speaking to empty chairs, addressing figures no one else could see. Occasionally, they claimed, a candle would gutter violently, scattering shadows into grotesque shapes. Shapes that seemed almost to watch, almost to answer back. In the quietest hours, George's mind drifted beyond memory into speculation. He imagined the children moving through the halls, their faces now distant specters, replaying gestures, whispers, and defiance. Their shadows haunted the walls, reminders that obedience had always been conditional, and that rebellion, however hidden, had left its mark. He listened for patterns in these echoes, tracing them like threads in a labyrinth, believing that even in absence, he could control what remained. Sleep came only sporadically. When it did, it was punctuated by dreams in which the palace itself shifted, walls curling inward, ceilings bending, corridors extending into impossible angles. In these visions, he heard the voices of all he had tormented, amplified, overlapping in a cacophony of accusation and imitation. Upon waking, he would record these hallucinations in new journals, diagrams twisting in directions no human hand should trace, ink forming spirals that seemed alive, insistent, reaching. Even as the king aged, his obsessions became more ritualized. Every hour had a cadence, measured by the tick of a clock whose hands he sometimes removed, sometimes reversed. Candles burned in intricate patterns, illuminating objects arranged with obsessive symmetry. Each object, each shadow, each whisper was proof of his ongoing experiment. An experiment now turned inward, with George himself the subject, prisoner, and audience simultaneously. Outside, the world moved on, but inside the blue room, time had collapsed into a dense, choking fog. George's mind, sharpened once by the precision of observation and discipline, now wandered freely among ghosts of the past, conversations with shadows, and the endless ticking of invisible instruments. The palace, once a stage for his experiments, had become a mirror of his unraveling, a labyrinth of memory, obsession, and voices that refused to stay silent. The palace, once alive with the measured footsteps of a tyrant, now exhaled only silence. The corridors echoed faintly with memory, carrying the remnants of footsteps, whispered commands, and suppressed cries. George's children moved through this hollowed space like ghosts themselves, each bearing the invisible scars of a father whose obsession had been meticulous, pervasive, and merciless. Amelia's siblings were changed in ways no words could capture. One withdrew entirely, retreating into a rigid solitude where every action was calculated to avoid conflict, every glance carefully measured. Another became restless, pacing endlessly through halls that once constrained, now liberated, haunted by shadows of discipline that had etched themselves into muscle memory. Their laughter, once tentative and bright, was replaced with murmurs, quiet reflections of trauma replaying in loops too private to share. Amelia, frail and haunted, bore the deepest imprint. Her illness had left her physically weakened, but it was the psychological residue that defined her existence. Even in the absence of George's presence, she sensed the echo of his scrutiny in every candle flicker, every shifting shadow, every sudden creak of the floorboards. Sleep brought fragmented visions, corridors stretching impossibly, mirrors reflecting distorted images of herself, whispers that had once been commands now become riddles she could never fully solve. The other children adapted differently. Some sought the company of outsiders, drawing solace from voices and faces untainted by the legacy of the Blue Room. Others became meticulous observers themselves, hyper-aware of gestures, tones, and expressions, as if the lessons of the past demanded lifelong vigilance. Each child carried their own ritual of coping, a quiet, almost imperceptible system of navigating spaces, relationships, and memories that were forever laced with the presence of their father. Servants, too, remembered. They spoke in hushed tones of corridors that still seemed to pulse with George's lingering energy, of doors that creaked open without wind, and of faint voices that seemed to repeat syllables long forgotten. For those who remained within the palace, the haunting was tangible. Objects displaced, shadows elongating, candles sputtering in response to unseen currents. Even after his death, the house itself seemed reluctant to release the hold he had established. And beyond the palace, the wider world remained unaware of the precise contours of his cruelty. Histories recorded him as a monarch, as a sovereign of decisions and policies. Yet the subtle, insidious terror he inflicted within these walls was invisible to outsiders. His children carried that hidden world inside them, a dark inheritance that shaped every choice, every instinct, and every fear. The trauma was not a single event. It was a lattice of moments, cumulative, corrosive, and impossible to escape entirely. In every corner of Kew, in every shadowed room and quiet hallway, the residue of obsession lingered. Even decades later, visitors and historians noted unease, a chill in the air, a faint metallic scent, the feeling of being watched. George's experiments had left no trophies, no monuments, only living echoes, spectral imprints of power wielded with obsessive precision, shaping the very minds that had once been his subjects. Years had passed since George's death, yet Kew Palace refused to settle into silence. Visitors, historians, and caretakers all reported sensations that defied explanation. Some spoke of shadows shifting unnaturally along corridors, elongating and contracting as though the walls themselves were breathing. Others claimed faint murmurs, almost imperceptible at first, like fragments of conversation carried by a whispering wind. The air smelled faintly of something acrid, like burning oil, seeping through the floors and walls with no identifiable source. Tour guides often dismissed these stories, attributing them to imagination or the echo of old legends. Yet those who stayed overnight reported a different reality. Doors creaked without wind, light flickered in rooms long abandoned, and the faintest impressions of footsteps traced corridors long deserted. The palace seemed alive with memory, each creak and groan a pulse of the past, each scent a reminder of the obsessions that had once ruled within its walls. One evening, a caretaker described entering the Blue Room, where George had spent his final years. The candlelight trembled along the faded azure walls, and the air carried a metallic tang, reminiscent of ink, wax, and unseen machinery. For a moment, the room felt suffocatingly small, yet vast, as if space itself had been distorted by memory. Shadows stretched across the floor in intricate patterns, forming fleeting shapes that seemed deliberate, intentional. A silent choreography of terror that no human hand had arranged. Visitors also noted an unsettling pattern. Rooms that had once been ordinary seemed to remember the King's experiments. Mirrors reflected images differently, faces elongated, features shifting as if observing the beholder. Candles, when lit, flickered in tandem with the visitor's heartbeat, throwing grotesque forms across walls. Some claimed to hear whispers urging them to move objects, to follow shadows, or to observe patterns in corners previously unnoticed. The palace was no longer merely a building. It had become a living archive of George's obsessions, encoded in atmosphere, sound, and scent. Even modern historians, armed with technology and rational explanations, were unsettled. Thermal cameras detected inexplicable cold spots. Microphones captured faint, overlapping murmurs that could not be attributed to wind, plumbing, or human presence. Every attempt to catalogue or explain these phenomena was met with new anomalies. Kew Palace, they realized, had been transformed into a monument of memory. Not one of stone and marble, but of fear, obsession, and the lingering imprint of cruelty. In the quietest hours, when the wind whispered through broken windows, and moonlight touched the cracked floorboards, the echoes of George's reign felt closest. A child's laughter, a shadow that flickered too deliberately, a scent of burning oil that clung to the air. all reminders that some experiments never truly end. Q Palace did not forget, and neither did the darkness George had cultivated. Each visitor left altered in some small way, carrying a fragment of the obsession, the fear, and the bizarre reality that had once consumed a king and his children alike. The corridors of Q Palace may have fallen silent, but the echoes of George's reign lingered like a permanent stain on the air. What had begun as obsession, curiosity, or even paternal concern had mutated into something unrecognizable. A meticulous architecture of fear. His experiments on his own children were not just acts of cruelty. They were a mirror, reflecting the extremities of power and the fragility of love when entwined with madness. In the quiet spaces between candles and shadows, one can trace the anatomy of control. Every note George scribbled, every instrument he employed, every whispered command was an attempt to dissect the human psyche, to bend it toward compliance, and to render the unpredictable predictable. Yet in doing so, he revealed the inherent danger of absolute authority, the capacity to elevate obsession above empathy, to confuse protection with possession, to transform affection into a mechanism of domination. His children, fragile witnesses to this relentless scrutiny, carried lessons far beyond their years. They learned to navigate a labyrinth where silence was safer than speech, compliance a shield, and observation an instinct. Each gesture, glance, and heartbeat became subject to analysis, and in the process, they discovered the paradox of power, that those who wield it most tightly are often ensnared by it, and that the line between care and coercion is perilously thin. Historians, visitors, and those who have walked the palace since George's confinement can feel it still. Shadows twist unexpectedly, corridors feel alive, and whispers linger long after the source has vanished. The palace itself became a canvas of obsession, where memory, fear, and authority were etched into the very walls. George's experiments did not die with him. They persisted, invisible but palpable, a testimony to the lasting imprint of tyranny. And yet, within the horror, a subtle reflection emerges. There is a profound, almost grotesque understanding of human nature in the precision of his methods, the fragility of compliance, the persistence of resistance, and the psychological weight of observation. Love, twisted into obsession, can instruct as cruelly as any whip. Care, when bound by the desire to control, becomes indistinguishable from punishment. In this, George L.S. legacy offers a grim lesson that even the most intimate relationships can be weaponized when the mind's equilibrium tips too far toward domination. Walking the halls of Q today, one can sense the echoes of what once was, the meticulous terror, the fragile resilience of the children, and the obsessive intellect that transformed a palace into a theater of fear. George's experiments were more than historical oddities. They were a stark warning. Power, when wielded without restraint, is an instrument of obsession. Love, when fused with control, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. And the line between them, once crossed, leaves scars that endure far beyond the lifetime of the one who wields it. In the end, Q Palace stands not as a monument of stone, but as a living testament to human obsession, a haunting reminder that even within the walls of royalty, darkness can flourish unchecked, and that the mind, when untethered, can create horrors far greater than any army or battlefield ever could.